Okay, so picture this. It's 1994. Grunge is everywhere. Doc Martens, you see them on every street, and everyone feels, well, kind of disillusioned. And right at the heart of it all, there's Courtney Love. She embodies all that raw energy of the 90s. You sent us this really amazing interview with Candace Oper. She really gets into all the complicated parts of Courtney's life, and, well, that's what we're going to get into today.
What I find so fascinating about Courtney is that she was both a product of her time, but also like totally different. She was this punk rock princess, but then she marries Kurt Cobain, the ultimate grunge icon. And their relationship, well, it just became this huge thing that people either loved or hated.
Yeah, it was such a whirlwind. They meet in 91, get married like 4 months later, and bam, you're like, this generation's John and Yoko. All that attention, all that pressure, it's a lot.
And that comparison, right, it's easy to make, but it also oversimplifies things. It turns the relationship into this like tragic love story. You know what I mean? It ignores all the stuff that both Kurt and Courtney were going through on their own.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit, Courtney. Born Courtney Michelle Harrison in 64. Her childhood, well, it wasn't exactly stable. Divorced parents, reform school. Then she's emancipated and gets this trust fund from her grandparents. It's a lot to deal with.
And it's really important to understand that Courtney was already doing her own thing way before she met Kurt. She was stripping to pay for college. She tried acting. She even went to Trinity College in Dublin for a bit. This wasn't some girl just waiting to be saved by a rock star.
And her music. Forget about those rumors that Kurt wrote whole songs. I mean, Courtney had already started the band. She was making a name for herself in the underground scene. All those raw, intense performances. She was, like, hungry for success on her own terms.
And it's interesting, right? Because her musical style was so different from Kurt's Nirvana, was like really introspective and melancholic, but Hole was explosive, in your face. Her lyrics were so raw and confessional, all about female rage and empowerment. It was kind of revolutionary for the time.
She wasn't afraid to, like, get messy, to just scream out all her pain and frustration.
Yeah.
And in a genre that was mostly men, that was a big deal.
Absolutely. It really challenged the whole male-dominated grunge scene. It made people see things from a woman's point of view, which was, I think, really refreshing, but also maybe a little unsettling for some.
And then, of course, there's that Vanity Fair article in 92 that really throws everything into overdrive. They make Courtney out to be a drug addict who used heroin while pregnant, although, to be fair, it's not totally clear when she found out she was pregnant.
Yeah.
But anyway, suddenly everyone's talking about it. Child Protective Services gets involved, and the pressure on Kurt and Courtney is it's huge.
And the impact of that article and all the media attention that followed, I mean, we can't underestimate it. Kurt was already dealing with addiction, with his own personal struggles, and he was incredibly sensitive to criticism. So a lot of people think that was a turning point for him, for his mental state.
It's just heartbreaking to think about all that scrutiny, especially because both of them, both Kurt and Courtney, were battling addiction. Heroin, it was this dark cloud hanging over them. And I think it's important to remember how complicated addiction is, not just for them, but for their relationship too.
Yeah, we often talk about addiction like it's so simple, but it's not. It's this huge, complex issue tied up in trauma, mental health, all those societal pressures. And for women especially, there's even more stigma around it. It's seen as this like moral failing instead of a disease, and that just makes it even harder to ask for help.
Yeah, absolutely. And for Courtney, who was already dealing with this wild child image in the media, the whole addiction thing, it just made people judge her even more.
Yeah, it just fed into this idea that she was somehow to blame for Kurt's struggles, that she was the reason he went down that path. And it's sad because people still believe that today.
Yeah, and then April 1994 happens. Kurt takes his own life, and the music world, everyone was just in shock. And after that, well, that's when all the conspiracy theories started popping up everywhere.
Did Courtney kill Kurt? Was the suicide note even real? I mean, those questions have followed Courtney for years, fueled by, like, speculation and rumors, not any real evidence.
And Candace Oper, in that interview you sent, she really breaks down those conspiracy theories. She points to, like, Kurt's history. He'd talked about suicide before, he'd tried it before, and he was clearly struggling with depression and addiction. It was all documented.
And I think this is a really important point that gets lost in all the drama. We forget that Kurt was a person with his own, like, complicated struggles. And his suicide, while it's incredibly tragic, it wasn't just a reaction to what was going on around him.
And we can't forget the bigger picture. Remember that statistic we talked about? Being a white male in a big kind of empty state with easy access to guns, well, that's a huge risk factor for suicide.
Yeah.
And sadly, Kurt fit that description perfectly.
It's a tragic reminder that suicide is not a simple thing. It's rooted in, like, our society, our culture, and individual struggles. To just point fingers and blame someone, that ignores how complex mental health is and all the things that lead to these awful outcomes.
And even with all those rumors and accusations, Courtney, she kept making music, kept building her career.
Yeah.
Just days after Kurt's death, whole release, lived through this. It's this raw, powerful album about grief, loss, and female rage.
And the timing, it was both tragic and, I don't know, fitting. It became an anthem for a whole generation that was mourning Kurt. And it really cemented Courtney's place as a musician, as a force to be reckoned with.
Lived through this. It hit people on such a deep level.
Yeah.
Songs like Doll Parts and Violet, they captured everything Courtney was feeling, all the anger, the vulnerability, and just this refusal to be silenced.
And it's interesting to think, what if Kurt had still been alive? Would the album have been received differently? Would it have been seen as, like, this masterpiece that it is? It really makes you think about how personal tragedy and art are connected.
And her performances during that time, wow. She was grieving in front of everyone. Her emotions were so raw and real. And I think it challenged how people thought a widow should act.
Yeah, she didn't fit that neat little box that the media likes to put people in. She was messy, unpredictable. She refused to play by the rules, even when she was going through something so awful.
It shows how strong she was and how dedicated she was to her art. She could have easily walked away from everything, but instead, she poured all her grief into her music, her performances, even her activism.
And speaking of activism, I mean, we can't forget how outspoken Courtney was about things like sexism in the music industry and how female artists are often exploited. She used her platform to bring attention to those issues, even though it meant facing a lot of backlash and criticism.
She wasn't afraid to call people out, to challenge the way things were, to fight for herself and other women in an industry dominated by men. And that took a lot of guts, especially back then, when women in rock were often pushed aside.
And that's a big part of Courtney's legacy, I think. She was a trailblazer. She refused to be silenced, to be defined by what other people thought. And by doing that, she paved the way for a whole new generation of female artists, women who weren't afraid to be loud, to be messy, and to be themselves no matter what.
And, remember that interview with Barbara Walters? It was 92, just a few months after the Vanity Fair article, and you could just feel the tension. Walter's questions were so intrusive and judgmental, especially when she asked Courtney if she was on drugs right then, and then, listed Prozac and heroin in the same breath.
That moment just perfectly captures how little people understood, how little empathy they had for mental health and addiction, especially for women. Prozac was this new thing, and there was so much stigma around it. To even put it in the same category as heroin, that's just ignorance, plain and simple. It shows a lack of understanding about both substances and their effects.
And yet, even in that awkward, uncomfortable moment, Courtney manages to, slip in some truth, some defiance. The Prozac didn't work, she says. It was like she was admitting her struggles but refusing to be defined by them.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even in those staged media moments, there can be realness, authenticity.
Yeah.
And that's what makes Courtney so interesting. She's unpredictable, and just when you think you've got her figured out, she does something completely unexpected.
Which is why it's so hard to say definitively, this is who Courtney Love is. She's always changing, always defying labels. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We're not looking for easy answers. We're exploring a life that's been lived under a microscope, trying to understand the complexity of it all. Yeah, it's about understanding, the context, all the pressure, the good times, the bad times, all the things that made her who she is.
And realizing that the Courtney Love we see in the news, that's just one side of her. She's a much more complicated person than that.
Exactly. We need to move past those simple labels. Villain, victim, or even just Kurt Cobain's widow.
Right. She's an individual, she's a talented artist, and she's a woman who's been through some incredibly tough stuff. We need to recognize that.
It's easy to get caught up in the gossip, all the crazy stories, but what's really interesting is the human side of it all.
Yeah, the resilience, the vulnerability, just the real messy experience of living life on her own terms.
And that brings up a really interesting question, What does it even mean to be authentic when everyone's trying to tell you who you are?
And that's something Courtney has dealt with her whole career. From those early punk days to when she tried to make it in Hollywood, she's always pushed back against expectations.
Even when it got her in trouble. Like that story about her and Axl Rose at the MTV Awards.
Oh, man, that's classic Courtney. The guts to ask Axl Rose to be her daughter's godfather, knowing he'd freak out.
And then how she fired back at him when he insulted her. It's like, She's not afraid of anyone, not even a rock star like Axl Rose.
Yeah, she's fearless. She's not going to back down from a fight.
Which is, it's admirable. But sometimes, let's be honest, it gets her in trouble. It's that unpredictable side of her that makes her so interesting, but it also makes it hard to figure out what she's really thinking.
Yeah, there's that duality to her, this mix of strength and vulnerability. That's what makes her story so captivating. It reminds us that even the people who seem the most confident, the most outspoken, well, they often have their own insecurities too.
And for Courtney, all that attention from the media, the whole Kurt Cobain legacy, it just made those insecurities even worse.
Yeah, she was thrown into this impossible situation. Grieving widow, controversial rock star, the subject of all these conspiracy theories.
And she handled it all in her own way, sometimes with grace, sometimes not, but always authentically.
And that's what I like about her. She
Maybe.
doesn't try to fit in. She doesn't apologize for who she is. She's just Courtney, flaws and all.
Which is, in a way, its own kind of rebellion. In a world where everyone's supposed to be the same, she stands out. It's like she's saying, it's okay to be different, to be messy, to be yourself no matter what.
And that message, it's so powerful, especially for people who feel like they don't belong. Courtney's story, it tells them it's okay to embrace who they are, to reject all those pressures to conform.
In this day and age, with social media and everyone trying to look perfect, it's kind of refreshing to see someone who's willing to be real.
Yes, absolutely. It reminds us that perfection is fake and that real beauty is about accepting our flaws.
You're so right. It's about celebrating the messiness of life. The good, the bad, the wins, the losses. It's all part of it.
And it's okay to not have all the answers, to still be figuring things out.
It's about accepting ourselves and each other with all our complicated, contradictory sides.
And that, I think, is the most important thing we can learn from Courtney Love's story. It reminds us that life isn't about fitting in or meeting other people's expectations. It's about embracing the mess, the unpredictability, the perfectly imperfect reality of being human.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What resonated with you the most about Courtney Love's story? What do you think her legacy will be? Let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and times of Courtney Love.